Hey, everybody, happy National Seafood Month. Before I get into the presentation, I realize this may be some of your first time interacting with our program. So just wanted to highlight Marine Extension Sea Grant. We are part of the National Sea Grant Program, one of 34 programs. It's a federal state partnership at the federal level with National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And of course, at UGA, we are part of the public service and outreach unit at the university. But as you can see here, ultimately what we're doing through extension and outreach and education, really trying to improve that economic, environmental, social health of our coast here. But I'm excited today as we talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is seafood. And I say a cordial look because this is a big topic. I was kind of laughing as I put this together. There's probably each slide could be its own class. So we'll hit it from a 100,000-foot view, but as Shannon said, if we have questions at the end, please, ask questions, and hopefully if there's something I do not know immediately, so hopefully I'll have my contact information to get back with the group. So I love eating seafood. I'm obviously biased, but I always think anytime, and I realize since we're doing a webinar, kind of thinking to yourselves, what's the last type of seafood you ate? And I realize it's not as effective as just shouting things out, but even in the Q&A session that you can enter. But it is always curious. Americans, we do love seafood. If you think about our per capita consumption is around 25 pounds. And that's gone up in recent years. Certainly nothing like chicken or beef, but if you're not aware, shrimp is our #1 consumed seafood in America. And so of that 25 pounds, basically a quarter of that per capita consumption comes from shrimp alone. But that's the nice thing where we live. We have the ability to have seafood from around the world and a diversity of seafood, whether we're talking fish, clams, and different inverts, even plants now. And that's something that brings opportunities and challenges at the same time. So if you're not familiar with the coast, maybe when you hear Georgia seafood, you probably envision a nice coastal scene like this with our marshes and the shrimp boats in the background. This is certainly an element of it, and the focus of it will be on this. But it's important to realize this only represents a sliver of what Georgia's whole seafood industry is. So I want to step back for a second. Georgia is not a big commercial harvesting state compared to like an Alaska or Massachusetts or Louisiana, but we are a huge seafood processing state. So we have to think about, like a lot of our other coastal states, the majority of our population lives away from the coast. So you think about just the consuming beast that Atlanta is from a consumption perspective. When we have things like Hartsfield Airport, we have the Port of Savannah we can bring access some seafood from around the world, really. And seafood is always coming into this state. It is a business friendly state. So when we talk about our seafood industry in a whole, it does include domestic. It includes local, that what we produce here, domestic within our own country. But we do import a lot of seafood too. In fact, these days in America, anywhere from 75-90% of the seafood we consume does come from overseas. Some of that includes seafood that we catch here, like even things like Alaskan salmon that might get shipped overseas to be processed and come back. So this is when we start talking about complex food systems. Seafood definitely falls under that. It does incorporate wild and farm-raised seafood. And keep in mind, more and more on a global scale, we are seeing the rise of aquaculture to help supplement supplement where there might be deficiencies in wild harvest. And again, a lot of complexity in that. But I do want to point out here that when we talk about our seafood, it's not just the men and women that are harvesting it, whether that's wild or farm raised, but it's the processors, the docks, the distributors, the importers, the retailers, and ultimately you as a consumer. And this is a very, very simplified supply chain that we might see here on the coast of shrimp, but it's much more complex than that overall. And just to give you, this is the only graph I have in this whole presentation, but I just want to show the point. When we look at our economic impact with Georgia's seafood industry as a whole, we are talking billions, so close to $4 billion. So this was back in 2021. This is the latest data from the Fisheries economics in the United States. But you can see the red when we look at our collective seafood industry with and without imports. There's a pretty stark difference here. And even that blue, that total impacts without imports, that's not just Georgia seafood. That's if we're bringing stuff from Alaska or Florida. So the idea that, we're talking about close to $4 billion in sales. This is an industry that employs over 20,000 people across the state in various capacities. So I do try to emphasize that because a lot of times when people live here, I'm in Brunswick on the coast, we, a lot of times only have maybe that view of like when we see the shrimp boat goes out, and that's certainly important, but that's only a piece of the overall economic impact. But let's focus on the coast, and that's really where the emphasis of this conversation is going to go for the rest of the day, is really talking about what do we have here on the coast? What's our local seafood industry looking like? You can put this in the Q&A. Don't worry, there's no quizzes or anything, or I'm not grading these, but just to get you thinking, based on value, what do you think has been Georgia's top 3 locally harvested commercial seafood products in the past several years? And I say several years, we're talking probably the last 5 to 10 years. Again, feel free if you want to type your answer. Let me give you the choices here. So blue crab, oysters, and snapper, shrimp, blue crab, and hard clams, whiting, shrimp, and oysters, shrimp, oysters, cannonball, jellyfish, or red drum, hard clams, and shrimp. So just something, again, as value, and just be thinking about what might be those options of what Georgia is known for. And again, just kind of get the neurons firing. But if you said B, you are correct. So traditionally, shrimp has been our biggest valued fishery. Blue crab a close second, but you're going to see a little bit of a change there. And in recent years, hard clams. We actually do have one of the largest clam farms south of the Chesapeake Bay in Georgia. And a lot of that has to do with how productive our coast is. So homing down a lot more, if we look at the economic importance of our fishing industry, our commercial seafood, our economist, Eugene Frimpong, always does updates. You'll notice I said historically shrimp has been our number 1 industry, but you'll notice blue crab is on top. This has a lot more to do with economic reasons than it does necessarily about fisheries, maybe environmental issues. I think a lot of times when we think about sustainability, we look at it from an environmental lens, which is obviously very important. But when we talk about sustainability in fisheries, you also have to look at trade-offs on economic and social. We've seen some major changes in our shrimp industry, particularly in the past several years due to imports. And I'll get into that a little bit more. That has certainly reduced some of the effort. At the same time, we know there's been shortages up in the Chesapeake Bay region. And I always laugh. I used to wait tables, and every time we'd have crab cake, someone would tell me they were from Maryland. And we have the best crabs, and I know kind of now, like, yeah, because some of our crabs go up there. So you're right. Maryland does have good crabs because some of them come from Georgia. But the point I'm making, even though we've seen declines in past several years on economic trends, this is still a multi-million-dollar industry. It still employs hundreds of people. And when we talk about the local fishing industry, we are talking about the people that harvesting, the people that process it and ship it out. So right now, based off the latest, blue crab edged out shrimp a little bit on the economic value, but we're still talking about millions of pounds of seafood that comes in. Hard clam still comes into a third. In the past, again, still in the millions of dollars. The most, we are still actually waiting on the most updated stats on that, but it's still a pretty big distance between the next seafood item. So the other part too, and this goes back to that cultural social, when we think about the fishing industry here, there's deep cultural ties to it. And it's a lot, this is how for many generations people have identified with our coast, is the ability to access and sell seafood, whether it's offshore or back up in our estuaries. And so it's not uncommon when you find fishing families to have multi-generations. There's challenges with that though, as you'll hear in a little bit. But this is something that it makes our coast very, it's a proud part of our coast, is the ability to have a very productive and healthy environment for the most part that can support the harvest of seafood. So the next several slides, I'm going to go through some just basic profiles of what do we have here, just some common information about how it's harvested, when is it available. Then I'll get into a little bit about management and safety. But for most people, the identity of shrimp is usually the signifier for coastal Georgia, what people think about. Obviously, wild Georgia shrimp, the majority of that historically has been our white shrimp. If anybody's from the Gulf or the South Atlantic region, White shrimp, brown shrimp, and pink shrimp are three what we call our pinnate shrimp species. Like I said, historically, about 80% of landings or what the commercial shrimpers would bring in was the white shrimp, with the rest maybe brown, and we get very few pink shrimp like you hear about in South Florida. But I would say even in more recent years, with changing markets, there's been more of an emphasis on that white shrimp. The good thing is shrimp's year-round available. But keep in mind, because of the way it's managed in state waters, which is through the Department of Natural Resources, out to 3 miles, and they cannot trawl in our cannot shrimp for in the trawl or cannot shrimp in our sounds or in our estuaries. But typically our seasons are occurring June through December, and what the state does is they have their independent assessments where they look at the size of the shrimp, the reproductive status, the water temperature. These are all factors that influence when those state waters open. If you don't know, shrimp's an annual crop. They only live about a year. So they're, this is not something, even from a management perspective, there's a single shrimp can release millions of eggs in the water at a time. So very fast reproducers, and they can grow very quickly too. Now, federal waters beyond 3 miles, and commercial shrimpers really don't go past probably 20 miles, and even that's a stretch. Federal waters in the South Atlantic go from 3 to 200, but we're not going that far out there. That season is open year round. The only time that it does get closed occasionally, if winter temperatures drop below a certain threshold, they will close off even the federal waters. But that's something to take in mind. That did happen in 2019. But generally, as you know, in the winter months, those boats can go out into federal waters and shrimp. And the nice thing is with technology, when shrimp is processed, you can get access year round. And I know a lot of times people want fresh, fresh, fresh. That's great if you're on the coast and you have access to that. But with the freezing technology, things like individual quick frozen shrimp, you can have access to very high quality shrimp year round, which is something that does give our state and the states around us an advantage. And I would say from an economic perspective, most of our shrimp here, that's harvested is sold locally, some in the regional level. But I hinted at this too. Our shrimp industry has undergone a lot of changes in recent years. Competition with foreign imported shrimp is by far one of the biggest factors, and this has certainly had impacts on a large scale. I mentioned earlier about the cultural importance, where historically you didn't go to UGA to become a shrimper. You learned it from your grandfather or your uncle or your brother. Georgia has an issue that is not uncommon to other states called grain of the fleet, where our boats have gotten older, the fishermen are getting older on an average age, and we're not replacing that workforce. So again, as the profit margins get smaller and smaller because operating costs keep going up, but the price of your shrimp stays the same or even lessens, this really has had an impact. So still a multi-million-dollar industry, still something, a coastal identity, but it is a major issue that we've seen in not just in the past few years, but really over the past 15, 20 years. As I said earlier, shrimp's our #1 consumed seafood product in the United States. Over the decades, the ability to produce it through aquaculture has rapidly increased. Aquaculture has its own impacts as well, just like any food harvesting system, but that really has had an impact from a socioeconomic aspect on our industry. And so unfortunately, scenes like this, where you have vessels even just sinking at the docks just because they haven't been kept up, is something that continues to challenge our industry. Moving on to blue crab real quick. So this historically has been our second largest commercial fishery. You can see that marsh in the background, and that's one of the wonderful things when you've got 100 miles of coastline, but thousands of acres of salt marsh. That really does help contribute to a very productive seafood population. And like shrimp, blue crabs are dependent on our estuaries. This is a trap fishery primarily, and I say primarily because sometimes the shrimpers will catch crabs as bycatch. That's the unintended catch, and if they have the right permits, they can sell it. Crabbing in Georgia is year-round. It does slow down in cooler months. So typically spring through fall is when you're going to have, especially in the warm months, where you see your highest productivity. But what's interesting, we no longer have any processing in Georgia for crabs. I think the last processing plant went away about 2008, 2009. So it's 100% live market, and it's really a local market with some being shipped up to Chesapeake Bay, even some going down to Florida. And then, like I said, crab traps, this is something, I mean, you have to look at what you invest into it, but when you see those buoys out in our marshes, it's what you're looking at. Is sometimes you have to, it's almost like navigating a ski slalom course with the buoys, but they're out there harvesting the blue crabs. There's also an offset to that. It's our soft shell crab. So if you're not familiar, a soft shell crab is a blue crab that has just molted. This is a short window, and when you look at the, several millions of pounds of crabs that are landed in our state, we're talking on a magnitude of maybe 10 to 30,000 pounds. So it's a much smaller amount, small window in the spring. But what happens is the harvesters, crabbers use specialized traps. So they'll the female immature females will be attracted. Sometimes they'll have a male crab in there because they do rely on pheromones. But they'll bring those immature females and they put them up in these shedding tanks or raceways where it's a 24-hour operation where you're actually the people that work there are making sure they're keeping an eye on those crabs. This inset picture in the top right here is one that's molted. And when they come out, they are soft and pliable. And then this is where they'll take them out. This is a delicacy, and this is where having I-95 going north and south. A lot of times these crabs, they can be sold locally, but a lot of times they're even shipped up to places like New York where people pay a premium dollar for soft shell crab. Hard clams or northern quahogs, if you're clam fans, as I said earlier, we've got one of the largest clam farms south of the Chesapeake Bay. This is aquaculture. So in the intentional, what I call, we're planting seed, and a seed is a baby or a baby clam. But what happens is the harvesters place them in bags, mesh bags, and they put them out in approved shellfish leases. And this is critical because if you don't have good water quality, you don't have industries like this, because the clams and oysters that I'll talk about in a second are filter feeders. One of the advantages that we have in Georgia is that we can grow out a marketable clam in less than 2 years compared to our northern states. That might take less than 3 years. So it's one of those things that does give a competitive advantage. There's the ability to harvest them year round. And if you've ever heard terms like cherry stones or little necks, those are all quahogs. They're just different market sizes. So the farmers will grow them to size specs that their buyers want and ship them out. So a lot of times it just depends where they're selling to them, but a lot do go to places like Canada and New York. And I will say, when it comes to clam farming, I mean, this is one of those things that we're fortunate that we have really good water quality in coastal Georgia. We certainly have some troubled spots. This is why it's very closely regulated for water quality, but it's an intensive process. And so the top little inset picture there is the seed. So it just looks like little rocks, but they're placed in those mesh bags and laid out. And it is pretty fascinating with our big tides here in coastal Georgia. When you go to these mud flats and you see almost what looks like a checkered board, and those are those clam bags. And so they use these skiffs that have flat bottoms that they're able to get out to these waters and shallow areas. And once they bring it back, that's where they're cleaning. And this is actually a clam sorter based off the size of the clams and even the different bagging and tags. So there's a lot of accountability when it comes to shellfish, also from the safety side of it. Making sure that that tag that goes with the clams, if it ends up going to me as a consumer and I go to a grocery store, I'm going to be able to know where those clams were harvested in case any issues do come up. But then there's the oyster side too. And if you didn't know, at the turn of the 20th century, Georgia was actually the #1 producer of wild oysters in the country. I mean, we do have the productive systems for that. Like the clams, though, these are in approved shellfish areas that Department of Natural Resource sets. So even though we can find oysters in lots of space, there's only regions where you can legally harvest it, and that's also on a recreational purpose. But here, the harvesting typically, and it just opened today, if I'm not mistaken. I saw an announcement from DNR. But for wild harvest, it's fall through the spring. And this really is a local market. They're great salty oysters. We call them blades, but they're not necessarily great for the oyster half shell market. So oyster roast are perfect. This is where we see a lot of them at, maybe at local bars is an opportunity. But this is where we've come into the farm raised oysters, and this has really become a growing industry here in coastal Georgia, and I think still a lot of opportunity. So only as recent as 2019-20, we had new policies placed that approved this. So we have 9 sub and intertidal leases. Same thing. You have to have approved areas where we can harvest the oysters. But they are growing. So start off in McIntosh, then Chatham. Now we have 3 in Glenn County. Hopefully there'll be more in the future. But the oysters are grown in bags and cages. And like clams, they start off as a little seed. We do have an oyster hatchery up on Skidaway Island where they will sell the seed to the growers and they will grow out. But the other advantage that we have here in Georgia, maybe versus a further north area, is the fact that we do our market size oyster be grown out in less than 18 months. And this is where it is going to that half shell market. So I find that people either love oysters or are kind of hesitant about it. But it really has opened up new opportunities. I do have a question, a true false question here, because we hear this a lot. But true or false, farm raised oysters should only be consumed during months with an R in them. So October, November, December. And if you had a 50-50 chance, but if you said false, you are correct. So this is an old, I don't want to say wives' tale, but kind of an old way for people to remember. Wild harvest oysters, the rules of the summer month, they are closed. A lot of that has to do with water temperatures, naturally occurring bacteria. Because of the way farm-raised oysters, because of temperature controls, this does not apply. So when you see new advertisements for aquaculture oysters, you can actually consume those oysters in the summer months. So a lot of times we'll see people saying, oh, you can never eat them during the summer. That applies to the wild harvest. So there, again, this is where sometimes the technology goes a little faster than maybe what people have always been, their belief systems are. But there are a lot of regulations when it does come to the harvest of summer or oysters harvested in the summer because of potential concerns with bacteria, but that's why it is so tightly regulated. So if you're not familiar too, in the past couple of years, our first floating cage farm, this is Tybee Oyster up off Tybee Island. Oh, sorry, guys. Pretty cool. I mean, this is where, again, these are those approved areas. You can see the signage up here, the mariculture zone. But these are these flip cages that the farmers use. And it's neat to see the new productivity that's coming from this. If you've ever heard of the salt bomb, that's one of their marketable oysters. So I'm excited to see about some of the other operations that are coming in line as well as Georgia, especially since if you look at around the country, you really have seen a sharp rise in oyster aquaculture. So shameless plug, we do have our Oyster Roast for a Reason coming up later in November. This is actually an opportunity to raise funds for our shellfish program, but also to promote the importance of oysters of our industry. So you can find more information on our website, but just had to throw that in there. What about fish then? Okay, so a lot of people always ask me, where can I get grouper and snapper, the ones that we like to see a lot? We are not a big finfish state as far as commercial harvest. A lot of that has to do really where the fishing grounds are, for especially for the offshore things that we do like, that we're used to, like maybe a snapper or grouper. They certainly do occur off our coast. What we do see is a mix of different kinds of reef fish species. Some inshore, that's really more of a factor of bycatch. And so hook and line types of gear are used, some traps for like black sea bass offshore. Our shad fishery, which is tiny and it's really a remnant, but does still allow gill net, and that's the only one. And then shrimp bycatch. So if you've ever gone to the store, and I'll show this in the next slide, a lot of times the availability is really based off regulations and the seasons, especially for some of our federal offshore sites like the snapper and things like that, because they are highly regulated, so that does affect when they're available. And there's currently, I think, less than 4 boats maybe that are going out and harvesting fish commercially offshore. The whiting and the flounder that I have here, that asterisk, a lot of times these are going to be more bycatch in the shrimp industry. Shrimpers have to have turtle excluder devices to protect turtles as well as other large species. This has greatly cut down on bycatch that historically was marketable. But whiting is one where, this is something that shrimpers can sell, and it's not uncommon to go into a local market and see whiting. Same thing with flounder. It's not so much that people in Georgia are going out and doing hook and line fishing for them. It might actually be coming from North Carolina or another state. But all these others, like spotted sea trout, I mean, again, we're talking very small levels. But really, when we look about our offshore fish, the snapper, the sea bass, a lot of that is really going to just the access to that's going to vary based off some of the regulations. I did want to throw shad in there because it really is It's a very small fishery. There's some that still do it up around Altamaha River. Most of that gets shipped over or out of state up to northern markets. Very bony, but some deep cultural ties too. So probably one of the more unique ones is cannonball jellyfish. I would imagine some of you probably have your mouths open if you're not familiar with this, that you can eat jellyfish. Maybe it's not as common here in the United States, but in a lot of Asian markets. In fact, for years, this was an experimental fishery, and it finally got passed legislation. At one point, several million pounds of jellyfish were being harvested. They used trawls in the wintertime, and it's a pretty clean fishery just because of they're not trawling on the bottom and it's for short tow times. But the jelly balls, they're clean, they're separated, they're salted, and then they're exported. They were exported largely to places like China and Japan. Because of different trade issues, that has really gotten cut off. So now there has been growing efforts of looking for interest in food supplements. There's high in collagen. So we've got some food engineers at UGA have been looking at alternative uses. They are still shipped to places like Atlanta, Chicago, where you do have large Asian markets, but it's something that most people, you're not necessarily going to go see, fried shrimp and fried jellyfish right next to it, but it is something that we produce here. And then finally, the ability, I know I'm talking commercial, but I guess one of the things that excites me as someone who loves to fish, we have the ability to really go, catch a lot of these seafood items on our own. And which I think that's one of the things that just adds value to our coast. I always just tell people, whether it's hook and line or crabbing or pulling seine nets or cast nets, you still have to have the fishing license. So this is something through Department of Natural Resources. Know your rules. I mean, this is why we have our regulations. A lot of times I find people, if they go recreational crabbing, think they don't have to have a fishing license. When it comes to saltwater, besides the normal license, you also have what's called a SIP, the Saltwater Information Program. It's free, but this is a way that the managers can then differentiate between freshwater and saltwater activities. But easy to access. And I always tell people, when you buy that money goes back to the state for everything from education to habitat and management. And that's a big topic in itself, but it's important to realize, whether you're in Georgia or any other U.S. state, United States has very well managed fisheries. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. Of course, that's the whole idea of management. You respond, you try to anticipate. Fish don't know borders. They don't know they're in Georgia or South Carolina. So in our state waters, Department of Natural Resources, our coastal resource divisions are the primary agency that's responsible. But then you have, on a federal level, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council that helps develop new federal rules, that then works with NOAA Fisheries to set them. And then there's interstate management too, because again, you might have something like a cobia that's going to travel across, or redfish. So it's important to know that we do have management at multiple levels. But then what about on the safety aspect? Because when we talk about seafood safety, that's always important as well. So just last question I was going to throw out here: which agency is responsible for managing the safety of seafood? Georgia Department of Ag, U.S. Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Ag, ANC only, or all the above? Hopefully you got that it would be all the above. Just like fisheries management, seafood is managed from safety at multiple levels, from federal all the way down to local. This also applies for domestic seafood and imported seafood. One part of the seafood business as a wholesalers is a program called HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. That's a wordy acronym, but the point I'm making here, it's a food safety preventative system. And in case something does happen, that corrective actions can be made. It's interesting that I have USDA out there, because normally when we think of seafood at the federal level, it's FDA. Catfish, ironically, falls under USDA, so we will have USDA inspectors sometimes if a local seafood business is getting catfish. But our Department of Agriculture, the state level, though, plays a big role in doing inspections, and everything from our Department of Health to even just county health and code enforcements, to make sure we have that safety net at all levels. So kind of the last tier of this, the case for local seafood. Obviously, people want local seafood. I mean, we know the sustainability of it's good. Economically, I mean, it adds stability to our communities. Generally, it's quality, as long as it's handled well, you have that accessibility and transparency with it. And so that's something that people take pride in. But we have to be cognizant that when we talk about local seafood in Georgia, the majority of what's going to be in the market will not be local. And that's not to be a Debbie Downer, but we have to be mindful that what we harvest here alone cannot meet the demand, even on the coast. We have to realize sometimes the seasonality, the regulations that apply might restrict, and that's something that does happen more. The geography of where you're at. If you're, I'm lucky in Brunswick. I work right next to a fish house, but my parents in Atlanta, even though they can certainly get stuff sent to them, it's not the same thing. And then also sometimes our preferences don't match what's available. I mean, there's not really a big drive for Georgia jellyfish right now at the local consumer level, but that's something we still have. So a lot of times people have to be mindful about mixing up their menus. And this is where it's coming to informed choices. And finally, this is another thing that's easier said than done, but educating yourself, which you guys are here, so I give you kudos for that. Knowing what we have, what we don't have, what might be limitations to it. And a good example of that is like snapper. Yeah, there's very few places where you're going to be able to get Georgia caught snapper, and being mindful of, but trying to find suitable alternatives. I can't stress this enough, but talk to the people that are selling the seafood. They should be able to answer questions. If they don't, they should be able to find the answers. If they don't know where they're getting the seafood from or alternatives, that should be a red flag right there. So, I mean, the transparency place, you have a right as a consumer to ask these questions and hopefully get clear answers. The other thing is doing your homework, guys. This is seafood's a complex topic. People have different value systems and beliefs. There's new data always coming out, but making sure when you're referring, Facebook's probably not going to be your first, shouldn't be your first choice of saying, oh yeah, this is probably actual information. It might be, but being, who's putting it out, how old is it, and is it something that's objective? So all of those can help make inform. At the end of the day, it's personal preference too. I can sit here and probably give you all the data, but that may or may not change your mind based off just your personal experiences and beliefs. But at least making sure that you are doing your due diligence when you're asking about what you're purchasing and where. And then finally, I mean, from multiple reasons, mix up that menu. That's one of the things that we're fortunate in Georgia and the U.S. that we have access, even if it wasn't locally caught, that we have access to different seafood choices. So it's something a lot of times people are hesitant a little bit to try new things, but I do think ultimately that helps diversifying your portfolio. We can certainly share these resources. There's probably about 30 more out there. We do have a Georgia seafood directory. It's in the process of being updated, but I know that's a question we get a lot of times of where can I go buy this? And at least it's a starting point. DNR, Coastal Resources Division, when it comes to our permits, the anything from shellfish maps to where the zones are, utilize your state agency. Same thing with South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. NOAA Fisheries Sustainable Seafood Site is very comprehensive when it comes to what we have nationally, import, seafood trade. University of Washington, this is more of kind of the science behind. There's a lot of vetted information about sustainability programs and research that ties into seafood. If you're concerned about the health aspects of seafood, this Making Smart Choices was actually a SEAF grant developed resource. Pretty comprehensive, and it's both got information for consumers as well as medical professionals about everything from nutrition to mercury concerns and in between. When you do, if you are catching your own fish and stuff here, our Georgia Environmental Protection Division, they do have fish consumption guidelines. So we do have some areas like here in Brunswick or maybe up in Chatham, where we do have consumption advisories. And particularly if you're pregnant or nursing or immune compromised, you do want to pay attention that depending on what you're eating and how much. And then finally, last two things on here aren't seafood specific, but are tied to it. This story map about shrimp really gives a broad perspective about about some research about just how the industry is changing. And then the boat story map is more about the cultural importance of our shrimp industry. And then finally, this QR code, if you want to scan it, this actually just takes you straight to our Seafood Month page on our website that Shannon referenced. It gives you an opportunity to see some of the other events if you're interested in signing up. And with that being said, I'm going to happy to take some questions. There's my contact information if anybody would like to email me or call me. Yeah, happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Brian. So I've added quite a few links in the chat for y'all to check out. So feel free to click on some of those and save it for once the meeting's over. We do have one question in the chat, so I'll ask that, but everyone is welcome to add questions, chat or Q&A. If you can do Q&A, that just keeps things a little bit more organized, but I'll go ahead and read this first one. So Bryan, this question is from Emily, and Emily is curious about finfish aquaculture in Georgia. Emily's been working closely with the USDA aquaculture census data and their last report in 2023. It indicates that there were 14 catfish farms, 7 trout farms, and 1 carp farm in the state. And though this data doesn't always capture the industry due to underreporting, no data past farm gate sales, etc.,
Yeah.
can you share any more information about this industry and market in general?
Yeah, Emily, I see you smiling because yeah, it's extremely tough. This is something that there's incredible opportunity. I mean, we have a lot of land in Georgia. I will say that the issues with the catfish, in fact, I didn't even realize it was that high. A lot of times by the time they get into like identified, they've gone out of business. Sometimes it's a moving target with our catfish. I actually, and I kept going back and forth. We do have trout farms. So if anyone actually ever goes up into the North Mountains, we have some awesome rainbow trout farms. They certainly have some local reach that get into the Atlanta markets. I wasn't even aware of the carp farm, but I know in the past when we've talked to some of our colleagues at UGA Extension, just tracking what's there, because by the time they start up, the profit margin was hard to keep up with. And then before you knew it, they would go out of business. And I had an aquaculture specialist years ago tell me that the best way to make a small fortune in fish aquaculture is to start off with a big fortune. I know people raising tilapia, that's the easy part. It's then trying to compete with global prices. Catfish, what happened? I mentioned earlier that most of our commercial seafood falls under FDA at the federal level. Years ago, there was a decision for geopolitical reasons to say we're going to put catfish under USDA because of concerns of foreign catfish. Well, you just like FDA, USDA has very strict safety regulations, and it ended up putting a lot of domestic catfish producers out of business because they could not afford the requirements of having USDA inspectors. With that being said, though, I know there's efforts at UGA to find new opportunities because, as I said earlier, Atlanta is a marketing beast, and I mean that in a good way. Just the size of it, there's such a demand. So there is interest in trying not only just your traditional farms, but also things like aquaponics, where you're integrating different species. I mean, there's down in Florida, they're testing marine aquaponics. If you're not familiar, Florida has a salmon farm in Biscayne, Florida, south of Miami. It's all indoor recirculated. The technology is advancing so much with aquaculture operations that it's no longer being restrictive of going, oh, this cold water species can only be grown in cold water. You have to get the permitting right, obviously, you get in the market. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's a lot of discussions among multiple entities, from universities to the regulators to marketers, of saying this is an area of growth potentially, but it's not going to be a straightforward process. But yeah, I wish I had a better track of where every farm was, because I feel like every time we have an update, something has changed. There's been shrimp farmers in Georgia for short periods of time, but they just have not been able to sustain themselves over a long period. So great question. Yeah, so yeah, and anyway, I'd love to hear from you if you know more, because this is something, a moving target is definitely a good way of saying that.
Thanks, Bryan, and thanks, Emily. Y'all are welcome to keep adding questions. We don't have anything right now, but Bryan, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
So here on the Georgia coast, we have so many people moving here from other places in the country, other places in the world, and other places that also have a large seafood influence. So I would like to know, as you work with people from other places, what's something that's very surprising for them when they come to the Georgia coast and start to learn about our seafood?
I'm going to go back to a couple of things. The scale. I mean, I would love nothing more if everyone just say we're going to go eat local seafood, and that's awesome because you are providing that stability. It does come down to math, and it's one of those things that for those of us that are on the coast, it is easy to be biased of saying, well, nope, I'm only going to eat local. So I think people have that perception automatically when they come here everything, even when they go to the restaurants, which has been a big issue with mislabeling and consumer fraud does happen. And I know the shrimp industry has been battling that. But I think a lot of times the assumption is if you've not been in a coastal community that automatically we have all these seafood products here, when the reality is, yes, we have some, but I think people are always a little shocked about the finfish. They don't understand why, where's the Georgia grouper and the Georgia mahi mahi. We have those things, and every once in a while the boats will bring them in. It's just not going to be at a consistent level. And if you're trying to run a business, you need product. So it is fantastic when a restaurant can say, hey, we just got a fresh catch in, and that might change. But the consistency part for consumers that come here, especially if their expectations are, I always need, want this species. I have found a lot of times, and I don't want to say disappointed, but I think that's kind of a shock on their face, realizing it. I think the other one, as usual, is jellyfish. When people come here and hear that we actually have an industry for that, albeit very small, it just kind of speaks to the fact around the world, a lot of cultures eat a lot more diversity of seafood items than we eat here in America. So I try to get them to think broadly a little bit about that. I will say for some kids, we were able to deep fry some jellyfish quickly, and they seem to eat that quicker when we fried it. So maybe we're onto something, but realizing that there's markets outside the U.S. that I see that as a potential opportunity for the industry as well.
Thanks, Bryan. We are getting a couple of questions, so I'll read these as they come. So our first question is from Lisa. And Lisa asks if there are regulations that apply to imported seafood, and if so, how are they enforced? Asking about why there's so much U.S. seafood shipped to other countries for processing, and if the U.S. is trying to change that.
Yeah, great question. So yes, they are. So it's imported, when I talked about FDA, when we import seafood, and especially for the requirements for the seafood HACCP, importers into the US have to follow these rules as well. What you will hear sometimes though, and people automatically, is that the seafood that is inspected at our borders is a tiny percentage. I mean, and I think it's like 2 or 3% that gets inspected, but you also have to keep in mind you also have businesses that do their own inspections as well. But so yes, those, if you're importing into the US, they're supposed to be following the same rules when it comes into. Now, this is always a challenge when you have the traceability aspect, because if something is harvested around the world, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not safer. But I'll go back to aquaculture. There have been concerns with farm shrimp with certain antibiotics that are not allowed in the United States, and so some of the shipments do get tested. Some of them do still make it through, and I think that's something that raises awareness when people are choosing seafood. But price, I think, for a large factor, still drives. Why so much U.S. seafood shipped to other countries for processing? It's cheaper to process it. When you think about the magnitude of salmon, or even trying to think, I know there's been some instances of lobster. It actually still is cheaper to send it overseas to process it and ship it back than it would be to process in the United States. One thing I did not mention earlier, not just here in Georgia, but the issue of losing our infrastructure. A lot of times someone can make a lot more money with a hotel or condo on the coast than you can a fish house. I'm not saying there's not a place for that, but even the infrastructure, the staff, the workforce to do that is another increasing issue. We're losing our ability to do that processing in-house. And again, sometimes it's cheaper to bring it overseas and bring it back. And so that's always a concern. The U.S. has always been a big powerhouse when it does come to exporting seafood. But yeah, the demand there too is imports. And sometimes, like, we have a tuna plant in Georgia. It's just, but whole frozen tuna comes in and it gets shipped right back out. So it's a global market that goes back and forth. And I think the other question about why local seafood is so much more expensive and it's less of a distance, that's another great question. But you have to look at the cost of what it takes to get from point A to point B. So you're right, you're not having to travel as far, like distance wise, but sometimes even going further distance by flight can be cheaper than driving it down the highway. But the cost of gas, the cost of getting the crews, the cost of packing fees, processing, all of those factors can influence the local price. And so, yeah, you would think local would be cheaper, but many times it can be more expensive just because the businesses that are doing it, they're trying to keep up with the operating costs that also are involved. Things like ice and water and fuel and crew salaries. These are all issues that are going to impact when, if you're doing it on a much larger scale and a more industrial scale, those costs can certainly be absorbed a lot quicker. And then I see yeah, okay. So there's also a question that, for anybody who might not be familiar with HACCP, yeah, management system food safety is addressed through the analysis and control of hazards from raw material production. Yeah, and again, this is something whether you are a local fish house here dealing with shrimp, or you're importing basa, which is a catfish from Asia over to the U.S., you're going to still have to have these HACCP plans that do identify what are the potential hazards. How do you mitigate? If you're allergic to shrimp, I can't cook it or freeze it out, but maybe that's where proper labeling comes in. And I'm not saying there aren't issues where things get mislabeled intentionally or unintentionally, but that's the whole idea too. If something does happen in a recall, there's those corrective actions that the business then takes and then can account for, hey, do we need to go back and maybe destroy a certain amount or recall? And the same things we see in agriculture, the ability to trace where that food's being shipped out, to whom, when, and where, what color shirts were they all wearing? I mean, like, really the details of knowing that traceability has really become a key factor in the global seafood trade. Good question.
Thank you, Bryan. So we have a question about the recording being available. We are going to work on it. We do have it recording, so we have it, and we will work to make sure that people have access to it. And I don't see other questions, but Bryan, you did talk about the Boat Stories project, and you talked about the people in this industry. So can you share a little bit more about that project and what you learned? And I will drop the link again in the chat for people who might want to check it out.
Sure. So I'm very fortunate. I get to work with a culture anthropologist from Georgia Southern, and we realize, just the power of oral histories, being able to hear, to interview people in the industry about their experiences and their challenges, has always been a powerful way, not only for the cultural heritage aspect, but if I get even everybody on this webinar, I get one of your stories, but all of a sudden now I'm getting all of everybody's stories. You start to identify themes, and it's also helpful for social scientists when we look at challenges the industry faces. But this particular project that we called Boat Stories was talking about the importance of the vessel itself, the shrimp boat, the history with it, the names, which is always fascinating. The idea of who who sold their boat to which person. And if you guys are ever familiar with the whole 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, trying to connect movies, shrimp boats are very similar. And it was fascinating when we do these interviews, knowing that, oh, this boat used to be owned by so-and-so who sold it to my uncle, who then, had forwarded on, or this one burnt down when I was on it. And so it really helps kind of tie in how rich the culture is with our fishing industry. But, at the same time, we did, was it 25 interviews? Some of those captains have already passed on. Some of those boats have sunk. So, I mean, this was only in the past 3 or 4 years. And as I said earlier, when the industry is going through rapid changes, it's a culture that I think we will always have. But when you look at what, the coast was 30, 40 years ago, it's dramatically different. So this is a way of helping to document that heritage and culture, but also tell that stories of the importance of the industry to our coast. But again, the idea of multi-generational families being in it, and really the pride they have of putting their kids through school by fishing, and what it means to them. And I think that's something that those stories really help shine through. So the story map's just a way of highlighting some of that and just kind of adding that socioeconomic piece of sustainability when it comes to fisheries.
Thank you, Bryan, for sharing that. That was a really cool project. And like you said, just very important to capture some of those stories. So I don't see any more questions. I am putting Bryan's email address in the chat right now. So y'all go ahead and save that if you want to follow up with Bryan on anything. And then I'm going to put one final link. So she says, is it the truth? In the chat. This is for a Seafood Month program called Taste of the Coast. This is happening on October 20th at our UGA Aquarium facility on Skidaway Island. Bryan will be taking participants through a demonstration on how to head shrimp and pick crabs, and then we'll gather for a cooking demonstration and meal from our in-house chef, Earl Jones, where he'll make a dish out of some Georgia shrimp. So that's going to be a really cool program. You'll get to talk to Bryan some more, hear some more from him. So I hope that y'all will join us there or check out some of our other Seafood Month programming. But with that, Bryan, do you have any final words for our group today?
Just to say thank you for spending your lunch with us. And yeah, please go out. It's a great time of the year to go get some Georgia seafood. And yeah, and I can't emphasize enough, talk to the people that sell your food. Get to know them. I think you'll benefit from that, and certainly they will too. And it's certainly an industry worth supporting. And I really do appreciate you guys sitting in on this.
Thanks so much, Bryan. Bye, everybody.